Chapter 10 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. Recording by Kalinda. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 10. Rome under Augustus. His buildings. The Augustan age marks a new period in the history of the city of Rome. Augustus boasted that he found it a city of brick and left it a city of marble. For the change consisted not only in the large number of new buildings which were erected under his auspices, but in the material which was used. The white marble quarries of Luna had been recently discovered, and this rich stone was employed in many of the public edifices, while the aristocrats, stimulated by the example of the Emperor, used bright travertine to adorn the facades of their private houses. The most striking change that took place in the appearance of the city during the reign of Augustus was the transformation of the Forum, and the opening up of the adjacent quarters. In this, as in so much else, Julius Caesar had suggested innovations which he did not live to carry out himself. The Roman Forum extends from the foot of the Capitol to the northwest corner of the Palatine. Adjoining it on the north side, but separated from it by the rostrum, was the Comitium, a small enclosed space in which the Curia stood. The first step to the transformation of the Forum was the removal of the rostrum (42 B.C.), so that the Forum and Comitium formed one place. The Curia had been burnt down 10 years before, and Caesar began the building of a new one, which was finished by Augustus and dedicated under the name of Curia Julia. But this was only the beginning of the new splendour that was to come upon the great centre of Roman life. A short description of the chief buildings which adorned it at the death of Augustus will show how much it was changed under the auspices of the first Princeps. At the northwest corner, close under the Capitoline, where the ascent to the Arx begins, stood the Temple of Concord, rebuilt by Tiberius in 10 A.D., and dedicated in the name of himself and his dead brother Drusus as Aedes Concordiae Augustae. Owing to the nature of the ground, this temple had a peculiar cramped shape, the pronaos being only half as broad as the cella. Adjacent on the south side was the Temple of Saturn, between the Clivus Capitolinus and the Vicus Jugarius. It was built anew in 42 B.C. by the munificence of Munatius Plancus. The 8 Ionic pillars which still mark the spot where it stood date from a later period. This temple served as the state treasury, which was therefore called the Serrarium Saturni. Between the Vicus Jugarius and the Vicus Tuscus, occupying the greater part of the south side of the Forum, stood the Basilica Julia, which, like the Curia, the elder Caesar had left to his son to finish. Begun in 54 B.C., it was dedicated in 46, but after its completion, some years later, it was burnt down. Then it arose again on a larger and more splendid scale, and was finally dedicated by Augustus a few months before his death, in the name of his unfortunate grandsons Gaius and Lucius Caesar. East of the basilica, on the other side of the Vicus Tuscus, was situated the Temple of Castor, of which 3 Corinthian columns and a splendid Greek entablature still stand. Founded originally in memory of the help which the great twin brethren were said to have given to the Romans at Lake Regillus, it was renewed for the second time by Tiberius, under the auspices of Augustus, and, like the Temple of Concord, dedicated in the name of the 2 sons of Livia. The Temple of the Divine Julius, built on the spot where his body had been burned by the piety of his son, stood at the eastern end of the Forum, facing the new rostra which had been erected at the western side in front of the Temple of Concord. Behind the Aedes Divi Julii, and on the north side of the venerable round Temple of Vesta, was the Regia, a foundation of high antiquity, ascribed to Numa, and used under the Republic as the office of the Pontifex Maximus. It had been often destroyed by fire, and in 36 B.C. it was rebuilt in splendid style by C. Domitius Calvinus, and there Lepidus transacted the duties of his pontifical office. But when Augustus himself became chief pontiff (12 B.C.), he resigned the Regia to the use of the Vestal Virgins. On the north side, east of the Curia, stood a building originally designed in 179 B.C. by the censors Fulvius and Aemilius, but built anew by L. Aemilius Paulus in 54 B.C., and since then known as the Basilica Aemilia. Burnt down 40 years later, It was rebuilt by Augustus, with pillars of Phrygian marble. The temple of Janus, which Augustus thrice closed, stood somewhere — the exact position is uncertain — near the point where the Argiletum entered the Forum, between the Curia and the Basilica ^Emilia. The Argiletum, a street famous for booksellers, traversed the populous and busy region north of the Forum, which was densely packed with houses and threaded only by narrow streets. Caesar formed the design of opening up this crowded quarter and establishing a free communication on this side between the Forum and the great suburb of Rome, the Campus Martius. In order to effect this he constructed a new market place. It was owing probably to this scheme that the Curia Julia, whose building began about the same time (54 B.C.), was built nearer to the Forum than the old Curia. The Forum Julium, as it was called, lay north of the Curia, and, like it, was dedicated (46 B.C.) before completion, and finished after Caesar's death. The chief building which adorned it was the temple of Venus Genetrix, mother of the Julian race, which Caesar had vowed at the battle of Pharsalia. As the elder Caesar had made a vow at Pharsalia, so the younger Caesar made a vow at Philippi. The vow was to Mars Ultor, and was duly fulfilled. The house of Mars the Avenger likewise became the centre of a new Forum. This temple, dedicated by its founder on the first of his own month, in 2 B.C., served as the resting place of the standards which his diplomacy had recovered from the Parthians. The Forum Augustum adjoined that of Caesar on the north east side. It was rectangular in shape, but on the east and west sides there were semicircular spaces with porticoes, in which the statues of Roman generals in triumphal robes were set up. It became the practice that in this Forum the members of the imperial family should assume the toga virilis, and when victorious generals were honoured by statues of bronze they were set up here. These fora of the first Caesars, father and son, were the beginning of a rehabilitation of this quarter of the city, which was resumed a century later by the Emperors Nerva and Trajan, and they established an easy communication between the Forum and the Field of Mars. Hitherto the way from the Campus to the Forum had been round by the west and south sides of the Capitoline, through the Porta Carmentalis. The Campus Martius itself, whether taken in the wider or the narrower sense, put on a new aspect under the auspices of the Caesars. The Campus, in the stricter sense, was bounded on the south by the Circus Flaminius, and on the east by the Via Lata. It was the great rival of Caesar who set the example of building on this ground. In 55 B.C. Pompey erected his marble theatre. Caesar began the construction of a marble septa, an enclosure for the voting of the centuries, which was finished by Agrippa. The name of Agrippa has more claim to be associated with the Field of Mars than either Caesar's or Pompey's. The construction of the Pantheon, which is preserved to the present day, was due to his enterprise. This edifice is of circular form and crowned with a dome, which was originally covered with tiles of gilt bronze. The dome is an instance of the extraordinarily skilful use of concrete by the Romans. It is cast in one solid mass, and is as free from lateral thrust as if it were cut out of one block of stone. Though having the arch form, it is in no way constructed on the principle of the arch. The building is lighted only from the top. The interior measures 132 feet in diameter as well as in height. The walls are broken by 7 niches, 3 semicircular, and alternating with them 3 rectangular, wherein, at a later period, splendid marble columns with entablatures were introduced. Above this rises an attica with pilasters, the original portion of which has undoubtedly been changed, since we know that Diogenes Caryatides once rose above the entablatures of the columns, and divided the apertures of the great niches. Above the attica rises in the form of a hemisphere the enormous dome, which has an opening in the top 26 feet in diameter, through which a flood of light pours into the space beneath. Its simple regularity, the beauty of its parts, the magnificence of the materials employed, the quiet harmony resulting from the method of illumination, give to the interior a solemnly sublime character which has hardly been impaired even by the subsequent somewhat inharmonious alterations. These have especially affected the dome, the beautiful and effectively graded panels of which were formerly richly adorned with bronze ornaments. Only the splendid columns of yellow marble (giallo antico), with white marble capitals and bases, and the marble decorations of the lower walls, bear witness to the earlier magnificence of the building. The porch is adorned with 16 Corinthian columns. Agrippa also built the adjacent baths called after him Thermae Agrippae (27 and 25 B.C.), and a basilica which he dedicated to Neptune in memory of his naval victories, and enclosed with a portico which from the pictures adorning it was called the Portico of the Argonauts. Another wealthy noble of the day, Statilius Taurus, constructed the first stone amphitheatre in Rome, and its site too was somewhere in the Field of Mars. The first Princeps himself seemed content to leave the adornment of the campus chiefly to the munificence of his lesser fellow citizens. But much further north than all the buildings which have been mentioned, where the campus becomes narrow by the approach of the Via Flaminia to the river, he built a great mausoleum for the Julian family, a round structure surmounted by a statue of himself. On the south side of the Flaminian Circus, in the Prata Flaminia, a region which might be included in the campus, in a wider sense of the name, Augustus erected the Porticus Octaviae in the name of his sister, and attached to it a library and a collection of works of art. It was close to the Templum Herculis Musarum, built by Fulvius Nobilior, the patron of the poet Ennius, and renewed under Augustus, and surrounded by a portico which was dedicated as the Porticus Philippi, in honour of L. Marcius Philippus, the stepfather of the Emperor. Near the portico of Octavia were the theatres of Balbus and Marcellus, both dedicated in the same year, 11 B.C. The first was one of those works which the rich men of the day executed through the influence and example of Augustus. The second had been begun by Caesar, but was finished by Augustus, and dedicated in the name of his nephew Marcellus. The Porticus Octavii, close to the Flaminian Circus, which was dedicated by C. Octavius after the victory over Perseus, was burnt down and restored under Augustus. It was remarkable as the earliest example of Corinthian pillars at Rome. From the Forum the Clivus Capitolinus, passing the Temple of Saturn, led up to the saddle of the Mons Capitolinus, the smallest of all the mountains of Rome. Thence it ascended to the southern height, called specially the Capitolium, the citadel of Servian Rome, where the treaties with foreign nations were kept, and triumphal spoils were dedicated. Another path led up to the northern height, the Arx, which underwent little change under the Empire. But on the southern hill it was otherwise. There new buildings arose under the auspices of Augustus. The highest part of the hill was occupied by the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, in which the senate used to meet on certain solemn occasions. This temple, burned down in 83 B.C., had been rebuilt, but it required and received costly repairs in the time of Augustus. Ranged around it on lower ground were many lesser temples, of which that of Jupiter Feretrius, to whom Romulus dedicated his Spolia Opima, and that of Fides, founded by Numa, may be specially mentioned. Augustus increased their number. In 20 B.C. he dedicated the round temple of Mars Ultor, and in 22 B.C. that of Jupiter Tonans, in memory of an occasion during his Cantabrian expedition, on which he had narrowly escaped death by lightning. This temple, marvellous for its splendour, attracted multitudes of visitors and worshippers, and its position at the point where the Clivus reached the Area Capitolina might suggest that Jupiter Tonans was a sort of gatekeeper for the greater Jupiter on the summit. But the Palatine Mount was the centre from which the development of Rome went out. It was the original Rome, the Roma Quadrata, where were localized the legends of its foundation. There were to be seen the Casa Romuli, the Lupercal where Romulus and Remus were fed by the wolf, the cornel tree, and the Mundus, receptacle of those things which at the foundation of the city were buried to ensure its prosperity. Under the Republic, the Palatine was the quarter where the great nobles and public men lived. Augustus himself was born there, and there he built his house. So it came about that the name, which designated the city of Rome in its earliest shape, Palatium, became the name of the private residence of its first citizen. The palace of Augustus was a magnificent building in the new and costly style which had only recently been introduced in Rome. Ovid, standing in imagination by the temple of Jupiter Stator, where the Palatine hill slopes down to the Via Sacra, could see the splendid front of the palace, worthy of a god. Singula dum miror video fulgentibus armis conspicuos postes tectaque digna Deo. The other great building by which Augustus transformed the appearance of the Palatine was the Temple of Apollo, begun in 36 B.C., after the end of the war with Sextus Pompeius, and dedicated 8 years later. It was an 8-pillared peripteros, built of the white marble of Luna, and richly adorned with works of art. The chief sight was the colossus of bronze, representing Augustus himself under the form of Apollo. Between the columns stood the statues of the 50 Danaids, and over against them their wooers, the sons of Aegyptus, mounted on horseback. Under the statue of the god were deposited in a vault the Sibylline books. In the porticoes were 2 libraries, one Latin and one Greek. On the northern slope of the Palatine, facing the Capitol, stood the temple of Augustus, which Tiberius and the Empress Livia erected in his honour after his death. On the south side the Palatine looks down on the Circus Maximus, which was restored by Augustus. Opposite rises the Aventine, a hill long uninhabited, and afterwards chiefly a plebeian quarter, on which the chief shrine was the temple of Diana, whence the hill was sometimes called Collis Dianae. This temple was rebuilt by L. Cornificius under Augustus, who himself restored the sanctuaries of Minerva, Juno Regina, and Jupiter Libertas on the same hill. Livy was hardly guilty of exaggeration when he called Augustus the founder and restorer of all the temples of Rome. A word must be said here about the triumphal arch (arcus triumphalis), which was a characteristic feature in the external appearance of Rome and other important cities of the Empire. Under this name are included not only arches erected in honour of victories, but also those which celebrate other public achievements. A triumphal arch was built across a street. It consisted either of a single archway, or of a large central and 2 side ones, or sometimes of 2 of the same height side by side. There were generally columns against the piers, supporting an entablature, and each facade was ornamented with low reliefs. Above all rose an attica with the inscription, and upon it were placed the trophies in case the arch commemorated a victory. The arch of Augustus at Ariminum, erected in memory of the completion of the Via Flaminia, and his arches at Augusta Praetoria and Susa, still stand. The general appearance of the arch resembles that of the gate of a city, and it seems to have owed its origin to the triumphal gate through which a victorious general led his army into Rome to celebrate his triumph. End of Chapter 10. Recording by Kalinda in Lüneburg, Germany, on March 21st, 2009.